So welcome old friends and new. It's lovely to be amongst so many friendly faces after, I think, 4 years since we last got together. And I've got a great pleasure in hosting this panel event, which is specifically to talk about corporate responsibility. And to frame the kind of exam question for this session, something we've been thinking a lot about at Gold Standard. If you think about our 20-year history, it's been in working to develop high integrity, high quality mechanisms for business, for companies and others to make positive contributions in the form of climate and development action. But really speaking, we need to move from positive contributions to actors that are fairly and positively aligned with global net zero and the achievement of the SDGs and whatever follows. And that difference sounds maybe a little abstract, but you've seen various media articles, as somebody said earlier, were sat in the home of The Guardian, and a lot of those articles, I think, speak to the fact that it's not enough just to make some positive contributions, especially in the voluntary space, where positive contributions can mask the various negative things that business still does. So in a kind of theory of change model, we will achieve global net zero and the SDGs if business writ large becomes directionally a positive contributor to that. Or maybe reverse that. Will we achieve global net zero and the SDGs if business makes some positive contributions? I think the answer to that is pretty obviously no. And so on that note, I've got a brilliant panel, my dream panel really, to discuss that. We've got a really nice spread from Luiz, who are making work very hard this morning to speak to the civil society viewpoint and go into a little more detail building on his earlier keynote. Kerry Constable, my colleague actually, a GS Technical Advisory Committee member, formerly UN Secretary General's Office and Google, so representing international policy and the corporate space. And then John Mitchell from probably one of the most important regulatory statutory bodies in the world at the US EPA to talk about how regulators and governments can react to the space. So we're going to try and keep this breezy, a little bit like a morning fireside chat, I guess, on a sunny day. And we're hoping to leave some time for questions from the audience at the end before I wrap up. So to get into that, Luiz, you gave a really nice keynote speech, sort of explaining the science, explaining the aspiration and the inspiration. I wonder, since the EU released the net zero standard, I think 2 years ago now, one of the things that did, and one of the things Sciencebased Targets has done overall, is to move us from a kind of arbitrary space, reduce as much as you can, offset the rest, who gets to decide how much is as much as you can, to this non-arbitrary paradigm that we're in now. And the net zero standard sets out a series of ways, I think, that companies can become directionally positive actors, including some of the stuff that you said earlier. So I wonder if you could give us a framing of how SBTI sees a directionally positive actor and what are some of the challenges in that?
Thanks. Well, again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here also sharing this panel with those fantastic colleagues. So I think, as you said, the positive change, I think the first thing that I used to work in the private sector, as I was saying, and I remember discussing with my team, and I was leading sustainability for a bank and for agribusiness at the time. And I used to joke with my team, which was true, that my dream was that our team did not exist, right? That we didn't have a sustainability strategy, but that sustainability was on the strategy. So I think that's what we're trying to do here, right? We're through those voluntary initiatives, trying to set what the direction of travel is. So slowly that is incorporated, not as something on the side, but something that is 100% incorporated into the business. And even for SBTI, my dream is that we are not needed, right? Because if in 20 years from now, we're still doing exactly what we're doing, probably that's not what we want, right? So the role of voluntary initiatives, it's really to lead the way, to demonstrate what is needed, to kind of demonstrate what progress looks like and continue to push. And as you're saying, that's what I think SBTI has done. SBTI does two things directly and one thing indirectly. Directly, we set the standards and the guidance. Directly, we validate the companies. But indirectly, we help define what good looks like in other spheres of this corporate action. So that's what we try to do with the voluntary initiatives, so regulation can follow, right? But we always, I think the theory of change is that we always continue to elevate the bar so regulation can elevate the floor until regulation gets to the bar, and then hopefully that time will come, and then we are not needed anymore. So I think that's one of the, as I said, one of the key things that we're trying to do, incorporate sustainability into the strategy and not so it is to make companies have a sustainability strategy, so they really change their businesses. Two, it's kind of leading by example, demonstrating that it's possible, so you reduce frictions and reduce the inaction by other actors, including regulators, because we're demonstrating that it's possible. There are 2,800 companies that already done that, so hopefully that increases the cost of inaction for other spheres of the corporate climate action. And finally, just a final point on this one, I would like to say there are the 4 A's of corporate climate action. There's accounting, and they happen in sequence, right? There's accounting first. You don't manage what you don't measure. So you need to do your greenhouse gas. So you're very dependent on greenhouse gas protocol and other initiatives like that. So you need to do your accounting. After that comes us. It's the ambition. So you don't define what success looks like. You cannot act. But that's just the middle of the journey. After that, it comes the action, which is really the most important piece. It's to actually deliver on those promises. And after that, there's finally the accountability, which is to check if you're delivering on that. So the final change or direction of travel that we're trying to do is how we move from ambition, which is what we do today, to the accountability. And so that's what it's a direction of travel that we don't do it yet, but that's where we are moving to doing, without reinventing the wheel, but supporting others. So once you define what success looks like, and then you start to deliver it, the next step within this journey will be the accountability to show that we're delivering on that.
Great. And Luiz, before we move to ask the regulator's view, can you, for those in the audience that maybe don't know the ins and outs of science-based targets, what are the kind of main types of target that you've got within the net zero standard?
Well, could you repeat the question?
So what are the targets within the net zero standard?
Yeah, so the net zero standard, again, we have 2 standards. We have the short-term one and the net zero one, which is the long-term one, right? So the net zero one builds on the top of the short-term one. The short-term one is what needs to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. The net zero one is what needs to happen in the 5 to 10 years, and then on the long-term one. So it incorporates both a short-term and a long-term perspective of that. And the main concept of the net zero standard, which is once companies can get to the end of their journey, is that they had followed a mitigation hierarchy in which they first have set the reduction targets for their own objectives, which do include scope 3, as we are going to discuss in a minute, which is yeah. I'll save for that. Save the discussion for that. And then at the end of the journey, it requires the abatement of the unabated or the compensation of the unabated emissions at the end of the journey. And some have interpreted that as SBTi being against the use of carbon credits, which is not the case. It's just that it's absolutely mandatory at the end of the journey once you have the unabated emissions. And throughout that journey, we want to incentivize further investments on those credits, right? And that's what I said at the beginning. But as long as it's happening in addition to your decarbonization, to guarantee that companies are not just buying their way out of their carbon emission. And we're trying to further incentivize that, working again with the colleagues from VCMI and other initiatives to guarantee that we're creating the incentive structure to further incentivize those. But the principle is that's the target, that's a mitigation strategy, that's where I want to get in 5, 10 years when my own emissions on scope 1 and 2 with intermediate targets, and then we do use of financial mechanisms through that journey.
Super. So we have this value chain abatement in line with science, and we have this end goal of neutralizing with removals towards net zero, and on that journey, a responsibility for the ongoing emissions. And I think with that, you have a science-based framework for what a directionally positive actor starts to look like. So from a regulator's point of view, John, what is how does the EPA see all of that? And maybe what are some of the regulatory tools and the non-regulatory ones that an actor like EPA can actually use to push business towards those ends?
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here. So when you step back and look at an environmental regulator, they find a problem, they define the problem, then they set a goal. So in the US, clean air, clean water, clean drinking water, clean water in the rivers, lakes, and streams. And then you start to regulate. What are the biggest polluters? How do you address it? Take steps. It's usually an incremental approach. You have goals. You set milestones to achieve these goals. And that works when you have time. We don't have a lot of time in different places. So for things like lead in gas, it was banned as of a set date. Lead in paint, banned as of a set date. There are very few of those, though, and most things are actually done incrementally. You figure out what the final goal is, and we heard about that earlier today, the importance of setting where you want to go, and then setting targets and milestones to get there. And I think a big part of this is to really signal to everyone, whether it's consumers or manufacturers, where you need to get and by when. And that should drive creativity and people moving, and they often move much more quickly than they thought they could. The other thing is, and we see it everywhere, there's always pushback. Always pushback, and often in the United States, organizations like EPA get sued by both companies and by environmentalists, and it's sorted out in the courts, and then you move forward. And then once the courts have sort of decided that, yes, this regulation, you have the authority to do this, basically people fall in line, and then you move forward. So other tools beyond regulation are really the carrot and the stick, or we heard about the push this morning, and that's really rewarding behavior you want to see, incentivizing behavior you want to see, and disincentivizing behavior you don't. And I was interested to read in the paper over the weekend about London's ultra-low emission zone that you have, and now it's expanding. And that's a classic case of saying, we want this here. We've done it for a couple of years, now we're expanding. Of course, there's a lot of pushback on that. And so then you create incentives for those people who in this case need cleaner vehicles. You provide some funding, ideally enough funding, to get them to take the right action. And then just a couple of other things is that oftentimes with incentives, it can be difficult because the people who are most able to take advantage of incentives, for example, right now in the US on electric cars, you can get a rebate. Well, who can afford electric cars? Well, the well-off can afford electric cars. Most people cannot afford electric cars. So that incentive then is going to people who maybe don't need the incentive, but are in a position to actually take action now. And so it does actually drive the market. Another example on this is we're moving forward to start to not allow new gas hookups for new homes and new apartments. And we're trying to promote electric heating, electric cooking, and one way to do that is to subsidize heat pumps for heating. And there's a program to start with low to middle income communities there. So those are the people who are most benefiting from that program initially. I could keep talking about this, but a lot of it's incentivizing, disincentivizing, rewarding, punishing, if you will.
Right. And I think, as Manuel put it really nicely in the previous panel, you have this mix of regulation and incentive, and really what we're looking for is the effective blend of those things. And so maybe just to follow up on that, the US is an interesting sort of cultural melting pot in so many ways, but one of those ways is, do people like to be regulated, or would they prefer to do this for themselves? So how helpful is it to have a voluntary framework like SBTI, and how does that voluntary to regulatory transition and interface, how do you see that?
Yeah, people don't like to be regulated.
Funny that.
People don't like to be told what to do. However, that is the framework that we have set up to achieve especially public health and environmental goals. So we often do set up voluntary activities. So, a good example is cars now. So you have a more progressive government entity like California saying by such and such date, no more gasoline-powered engines will be allowed to be sold. And then that drives the market. And so that companies see the writing on the wall, as it were, and say, we have to get ahead of this. And so we've been moving much more rapidly, voluntarily, on electric cars being sold in the US, and it looks like we're going to be able to meet the goal in California. It would be very difficult to have that goal nationally because of all the pushback. So voluntary programs are really important because they also set the stage for regulatory programs. Because if you have a voluntary program for a number of years, and people know about it, they hear about it, they understand the need for regulation. And it's a lot easier then to get the regulation that you're looking for.
Right, building off a kind of discourse already in that sense. And so, Carrie, thinking about your varied experience, but specifically in this case from your private sector background, what have you seen as the kind of effective nudge there? Why would companies want to do this even without regulation? And maybe I'll flip that around, say, why wouldn't they? What are the barriers in that sense?
Yeah, thanks, Owen, and great to hear everyone and be here. And there are several barriers. I mean, I think these days companies are really, there are several companies that are doing the right thing because there's a huge moral imperative, and there are several companies that are doing it for that reason, for the moral reason, and I'll go into incentives, a little bit later. I would say, in terms of barriers, there are a few. There are three that I'd like to highlight. I mean, one is, and I've been on the side of setting net zero targets with SBTI, also setting science-based targets, and being on the side of implementing them. And I would say one of the key things that's very difficult when you're sitting in a company is the uncertain tech and the uncertain costs. I've been in the climate space for a long time. I'm a complete believer, live and die, by climate action. And it is extremely challenging to set a target, set strategies, develop roadmaps, and know that the climate tech to get there, we don't know, at least 30% of it, and therefore we don't know the costs for over 30% of, so you're presenting to CFOs with significant error bars, and that is a challenge. And so I think I think with all of these barriers there are ways to resolve them, and I think one of the resolutions that I would advocate for is that we really enhance the education to climate and sustainability leaders within companies to help their CFOs, et cetera, and sort of business executives that aren't doing climate and sustainability every day to understand that and socialize that. The second, I would say, is the short-termism of corporate targets. I mean, companies are operating on a quarterly basis, and I think we have all seen what's happened over the last 2 years. I mean, things change extremely quickly. And it is quite challenging to develop and stick to and continually incentivize for a long-term target for 2050. It still needs to happen, and that is critical. But what I would say we also need to do as a climate community is help companies to translate and decentralize, so to speak, that 2050 target into what does it look like every quarter? And I think the SBTs do that, but I think we could do more hand-in-hand collaboration with companies as they are adjusting that 2050 target to the short-term nature of their operations. So I would say the short-term nature is quite important. And then the third barrier, which I also think we have many solutions for, is the sheer number of frameworks and standards and guidance that is coming down the pike. I think we're at a very interesting and different time for the climate space right now, and I think it's a really good time in many ways. It's a time when voluntary standards are ramping up, when regulation is also ramping up at the same time, when we are all driving for accountability, integrity, etc. It also means that when you are sitting in a company, you are getting new standards, new guidance, new surveys, potentially new regulation, every day. And it is, and I think, when Luiz was mentioning the 4 A's, I think those 4 A's are absolutely right. I think when you are sitting in a company, most of your daily work is focused on the A, accounting, and the A for accountability, and not the A for action. Right. And I think that's where we really have to reset.
Yeah, and I mean, building on your sort of first barrier a little bit, and something Luiz said in his keynote this morning was interesting, that there's a real kind of knife edge, damned if you do, damned if you don't if you're a company. If you do set a target but don't have a plan, you can get criticized. But at the same time, aren't you also acknowledging this is really important even if I don't know how to do it? So how does a company navigate that very tricky space?
And I think these days there is a big emphasis on measurement, data, accounting, and reporting. So I think, and that, again, it doesn't mean that we need it. We absolutely need it. But I think, my perspective is that there's an over-indexing, and it means that there is a lot of focus on, okay, we need to get these numbers right, because if they go out in the public, we will have a very difficult life if they are wrong. And that is true. Like we have to do that. We have to get it right. I think what concerns me is that there isn't that is happening sort of at the expense of action. And I think there are some examples, and I'll speak about Google because I was there, and they, Google's a unique company. It's not, but there are initiatives like Google X where they are doing fantastic work, really R&D lab, and investing in the moonshots, to take Luiz's earlier speech, and those kinds of efforts. I mean, we want companies to be harnessing their engineers, their researchers, their R&D. I mean, that's the right, but there isn't a framework that gives a company credit for that. And so what could happen, and I think there's a bit of a risk right now, is that the accounting and the measurement and getting it right publicly, in terms of targets, and that's all getting, companies are getting credit for that, and that is good. But I think the efforts that they're making on their own volition to take action and to take risks and to try moonshots, that's not getting the credit that it deserves. And I think we've got to figure out, and I'm not saying we set another target for moonshots, because I think, but I think some way, what does it look like to incentivize action when it may not require a target per se, but can you still maintain integrity that way? I think that's the question.
Right, and to pursue that other side of that equation as well, do you think it's ever possible that we might get to a place where companies might even feel comfortable to say, you know what, we planned this, we accounted for it, data's got better, or we made a mistake? Or is it always going to be a case of, can't lose public face?
I think some of that, personally, and I'd love colleagues' perspectives, would need to come from a blessing from externally. I think if let's take a regulator, whichever country, and a voluntary standard, and the Guardian hypothetically were to say, we're going to, this month is going to be dedicated to, praising companies that have come forward and talked about their failures and their, and how hard this is and what they missed. And I think if that were celebrated, then, and I think in some ways it should, because this is, no one knows how to do a lot of this. And so I think we need to give companies that space. But I think right now there isn't that space.
Interesting. So Luiz, jump please.
I just wanted to jump in and just say that I think one of the reasons is this fear, right? This fear of coming out and saying we set this goal and we are not making it. However, I would say it'd be much better to come out and say it rather than have the Guardian say it for you and say we looked into it and they said they were going to do this and now they're not. So I think there is an incentive to get out ahead of that, but I think nonetheless it's very hard to do.
Right. No, thank you. And Luiz, we're obviously going to fix Scope 3 in a minute, but before we do that, science-based targets to some extent suffers a similar challenge, right? It's an evolving premise. Nobody, as you said earlier, has done it before. You must feel that pressure of not being able to get it wrong as well. Do you think there's a way of shifting that culture generally? So keeping the best of the criticism, but losing the worst of the fear?
Yeah. Well, I think. Well, two things. Well, the first one, absolutely right. We're navigating the edge of knowledge, so nobody has all of the answers. And I'm 100% a believer that transparent and being ahead of the conversation is what brings that credibility. So just taking off my hat of SBTI, but just sharing a little bit of a previous experience when I used to work, and we're going to discuss again scope 3, but I used to work for almost 20 years of my life on eliminating deforestation from global supply chains. So back in 2010, when companies start to make, oh, I don't want deforestation on my beef, I don't want deforestation on my palm oil, right? That's where I was, so getting pressured by the companies that were buying. So, well, prove that the beef they're producing is free of deforestation. And we didn't have all of the answers as well, right, at the time. And I was working in companies on that sector. And it was dealing with scope 3. Now we can map with satellites, hundreds of thousands of suppliers at the same time, but back then in 2010 was not possible. But we had to advance. But I think, again, when I was sitting on that place, which I'm not anymore, on the other side of the table, I think, again, transparency was the key, was setting exactly what the goal was, and then we would get criticized. But then I remember once I was working on this company, and we got an NGO that sent us, you're financing this one farmer, and I just realized that this farmer has deforested. What are you going to do about it? If you don't respond in 3 days, we're going to make a campaign against you, right? We went like crazy at the time, look out, and we actually mapped, and we knew that the farmer had deforested. We already had a plan together with that farmer. And the farmer had some fines. We didn't know that they had the fines at the time, so we went back to the NGO and said, look, we already have a plan. We knew that. We didn't know about those fines, so thank you for it. And we didn't get bashed at the end, right? The NGO understood that. So having the plan, acting, demonstrating that you're acting on it, and then pointing out the flaws when you don't have it, and being fully transparent about that, I think that's the way to go, and that's what we're doing at SBTI as well, right? That's what we're saying when I joined. I said, well, number one goal is enhance our governance even further, and ever since, we now have a technical council in place, we have a new governance system in place, we have reduced the waiting time for validation. So I think setting the goal and being transparent whether we're advancing or not, that's the way forward, regardless of where you are on this ecosystem.
Right, right. And in many ways, we don't expect companies to magically plan their profit curve over the next 20 years and not respond to any risks or take any opportunities. Yet when it comes to this existential crisis, they have to be perfect. So it's an interesting kind of cultural shift, I think, needed. And nowhere is that more acute than scope 3, and we don't actually have to fix scope 3 in this session. We might do that over the next 2 days. But it is the most acute problem. CDP estimated 70% of the world's emission are in complex supply chains. They're not always very visible. The chain of custody can often be very poor. Data quality is very poor, but the opportunity there is enormous. So how do we, and what are SBTI's plans specifically in the space of scope 3 to think about unlocking that potential for navigating that inevitably rocky period while some of the traceability technologies you mentioned come online? How do we keep the rate of change up in scope 3 while moving it forward?
Well, thanks. Well, the first one, as I said, what is the role of SBTI? There's stuff that we do directly and there's stuff that we do indirectly. So the indirect impact here was nobody discusses now that scope 3 is paramount, right? So I think that's a big win because we do know that emissions are 11 times higher. So we're not going to tackle our global climate crisis if we don't tackle scope 3. So I think that's again a win for us to celebrate because it's on the table and we need to tackle it. The second one is then always impossible, right? Because they're too complicated. Well, two things. Well, the first one is not all scope 3 emissions are created equal, right? And we have to recognize that. Some are much harder, some are easier. For example, downstream scope 3 emissions, if it's harder, but sometimes it's under your control. If you're producing, for example, manufacturing, equipment, just make your equipment better and consuming less energy, and you have under control. And it's a way to tackle that. Upstream scope 3 emissions, if you're, for example, in food and agriculture, which is the sector I know the best, then it's hard because you have to map hundreds of thousands of suppliers. But again, it has been done before, right? Look at Amaral sector, for example. Nothing to do with environmental sustainability, but 20 years ago, they had big problems with their supply chain when it came to human and labor conditions. And you talk to them 20 years ago and they say, oh, it's impossible. It's a supplier of a supplier of a supplier in a small sweatshop in Vietnam. There's nothing I can do. Well, we still have some problems, but they kind of fix it, right? Or are getting close to fixing it. The other example that I gave on deforestation from supply chains, not fixed it yet, but again, now you can map hundreds of suppliers with satellites. And that would not have happened if we had not tackled that. And again, I was there 15 years ago saying, it's impossible, I cannot map that. And now I'm saying, well, we can do it actually, right? So it's a challenge. So the first one is recognize the challenge. Second one is measure the size of the challenge. And then the third one is trying to look for the solutions. Where are the low-hanging fruits, the stuff that you can do today, and other things that you need to push forward. So what is the stuff that you can do today, right? The first one is map the size of the problem. For some, and if the 20-80% rule applies, it's my guess that probably 80% of scope 3 emissions can already be tackled by 20% of your suppliers, for example. So start with those, right? Even if you don't have everything, probably 20% of your suppliers already represent that. The second thing is, the more folks are in, the easier it gets for everyone. If everyone is in, then you don't have a scope 3 problem, right? Because all the emissions are tackled by scope 1 and 2. So that's why the first thing that we have done, we just published our supplier engagement guidance, which is exactly to try to support companies on that journey and say, well, if you don't know where to start there. Bring your biggest suppliers in, because by this way, you're already making your scope 3 emissions somebody else's scope 1 emissions covered by the target. So I think this is the one thing. The second thing, as I said, are for folks that have scope 3 emissions downstream. They can just make their products better. So that's another way to tackle. And the third one, which is the bigger one, we are currently starting to... The problem with scope 3 is you can take a picture of your scope 3 emissions. The truth is you cannot make the motion picture of scope 3 emissions as of today, right? So it's a good tool for planning, but not for management. So that's where we need to tackle. So we're starting to scope projects on what does it mean to do monitoring and reporting on scope 3. Again, we don't have all of the answers yet. We hope to work with you all to kind of create the guidances further. So summarize, on the short term, engage your suppliers, make your products better. That's what you can do now. Measure in order to manage, and then work with us to try to define what is the next step on making a picture of scope 3 into a motion picture of scope 3 so you can actually manage it.
Yeah, thank you. And we do have a deep dive into scope 3 tomorrow that I'm moderating, so we'll fix it there. So from value chain abatement to one of the other really interesting concepts in SBTI, and they have a consultation out on this at the moment, which is well worth reading, on beyond value chain mitigation, which is kind of a responsibility, in long form, take responsibility for your ongoing emissions by financing beyond value chain mitigation. I can see why you shortened the name of that. But just John and I share a passion, as do much of our audience, in clean air and clean cooking, which has traditionally fallen through the carbon markets into that bucket of responsibility for ongoing emissions. So I wonder, John, with kind of that hat on, how easy is it for a regulator to think about and incentivize / regulate for that kind of responsibility? And how easy and how do you see us helping that kind of finance in the clean cooking sector from them?
Yeah, thanks. Some of you may be wondering what somebody from a regulatory agency is doing in a voluntary carbon market meeting. I work in a voluntary program, the Indoor Environments Division at EPA, and I've been working on household energy and cook stoves for about 20 years, first running the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air, and now working with numerous partners on lots of clean cooking issues. And I just want to step back a second and say that we, about 18 months ago, working with the Clean Cooking Alliance, launched the what we call 4C, Clean Cooking and Carbon Consortium. And we work with UNFCCC, the Berkeley Air Monitoring Group, Stockholm Environmental Institute, and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And we first started working together because we saw an opportunity to put household energy in NDCs. We'd kind of happened upon it, and we were like, wow, this is a real opportunity. So we started reaching out to country governments saying, please put it in, please do this, and they did, and we're up to about 75 countries. And then it was like, okay, now what? So, okay, they need help and guidance on implementation and on monitoring, reporting, and verification. And so we came up with guidance on that. And the idea is to really lower barriers for countries to actually take action. Because it's easy, as we've heard before, just to say you're going to do it, now what? And a lot of countries are like stuck at the now what stage. And so we started working with countries, and then it became apparent that there's just so much funding coming from the carbon sector that countries needed support in how to address this. And then we started looking at all the carbon methodologies, and we went down this road of saying, okay, hey, we need to strengthen these carbon methodologies. These carbon methodologies need to have more credibility. They need to be more robust. We believe that by strengthening them, actually these carbon credits will be worth more money because there's a lot of uncertainty out there now, and a lot of this is based on methodology that's years old. And as we were talking about with satellites, we know so much more now. So we're actually in this process of going ahead and developing a new carbon methodology over the next 6 months. We're a lot of input from everyone, carbon developers, manufacturers, and governments. And then this hopefully will lead to actually governments regulating to some degree the carbon market in their country. And what I mean by that is through the ISO process, we developed standards for measuring cook stove performance in the lab and in the field, and then we have tiers of performance for different indicators. And we can envision a country saying, hey, if you're going to get carbon credits, your stove needs to be at least tier 2 for efficiency over the next 3 years. And then in 3 years, we're going to say it has to be tier 3 to drive innovation, to drive performance, to ensure that the best available stoves are sold in the marketplace. Because right now, there's no incentive for the best available stove. It's just stoves that are available, and there's not enough incentive, as we were talking earlier about the pull to get better stoves. So that's one of the things that we're working on.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I think, it's an interesting bucket of target setting bucket and finance, the beyond value chain mitigation, because as you said earlier, people don't love to be regulated. They certainly don't love to be regulated for their clean cooking or their cooking generally. I'm not sure how you'd regulate my chaotic cooking. It is also outside of value chains. So it's a sort of an area of the net zero journey that doesn't fall neatly within any other bucket. And that's both risk and opportunity. And so, Kerry, we talked about the barriers with you earlier. What are some of the incentives that you see, and how do we build those up?
So I think a lot of the incentives are sector specific. There are overarching incentives. I do think, despite my earlier comment that there is a bit of drowning by accounting, so to speak, that regulation and voluntary standards are incentivizing, and so I do think that. In addition, I would say that. There is generally, resilience is generally an incentive driver. So I think for companies of all kinds, and that's, just because of the sheer, just as natural hazards come down are increasing in severity and frequency, obviously business operations, whether you're running a data center or an industrial operations, are under threat. And so there's push for clean energy and independent grid, et cetera, and grid improvement for that. But then, other than those, kind of more overarching, I do think that many incentives are very sector specific. I think consumer-facing companies obviously have a certain kinds of incentives, and they are incentives driven by types of consumers, right? So it's CPG companies are responding to certain requests from those consumers. Tech companies are responding to different incentives. So I think, and which I think is really important to acknowledge, because I think that's where guidance and claims, it will help to get those to be much more refined. I do think, I'm a bit involved in the SBTI's BVCM, the Beyond Value Chain Mitigation work, which I think is really, really important, really timely, and there will be an incentive research paper, I think, coming out soon, which I think is very important that we start looking at really what are the incentives for steel companies, and why did a bunch of steel producers plus financiers come up with the sustainable steel principles, right? And are there claims that now could be associated with sustainable steel, for example? Also on procurement, there are a lot of companies that have come together to purchase clean energy. That's happened for years, so, right? REBA, now SEBA. I was part of founding Frontier, which is carbon removals. So a lot of competing companies came together to invest in carbon removals, almost $1 billion last year. And that was a voluntary initiative. There wasn't a standard, but it was, well, the net zero standard did influence, but I think that the incentive was, to drive to solve, but also to unite and build an industry, and then also have price, you bring down the prices. And so I think that incentives are really nuanced, and for that reason, I think we should really look at, what does each type of company want out beyond the sort of obvious moral obligation and the regulatory pressure, but what will drive more? And that's usually quite nuanced. It's usually quite sector specific, and I think we can capture that by understanding it better, and then adjust claims and work with companies and ask companies themselves what claims they want to develop out of those sector solutions and sector challenges that they're having.
Great, thank you. And so I want to leave a little bit of time for audience Q&A, so maybe a quick fire to Luiz and then to carry on building on that. I mean, it's fairly obvious from what you've been saying and a cursory glance at SBTI's website that the sectoral pathways are beginning to open up. And one of the things that we've been thinking about at Gold Standard is we have an accountability, correctly science-based accountability mechanism that builds on inventory accounting that at its best gives us kind of accurate planning and management tools, but at its worst sort of isolates each company from the others. So how do we move from individualistic thinking towards more holistic collaborative accountability, do you think? Because we can't solve this as individual companies, right? No supply chain can be decarbonized that way.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not on script, so that's a thing. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, again, I think we're, as I said, we're with the risk of becoming a broken record, we're navigating the edge of knowledge, so we don't know all of that. What I do know is that we do have to measure in order to manage, right? Usually when I talk to folks, they come to me like, I know, C-suite folks in companies, and they tell me, Luiz, you need to make this as easy as it is to do a balance sheet. It's too complicated. There's too many jargons. I was like, yeah, but do you know that the first standards on balance sheets are like from the late 1800s? That there's 100 years of history, that now there are 2 million accountants that go to grad school to become accountants. So it just looks easy because there's 100 years of history of a system being created. We're creating this one from scratch on the past 4 or 5 years, and we don't have 100 years, so we need to move faster, right? So I think, but that's when I said, so we don't have all the answers, right? But I do believe that we do have to set a goal. That's the number one thing that you need to do, because you need to define success. Then things follow up. First thing is trying to bring everybody in, because the more folks are in, the easier it gets to everyone. As I said, if everybody was in, we didn't have to even measure scope 3, right? So I think that's one. And then the other ones is innovation people are there to help create that. And that's why our goal is kind of set the bar so folks come. Again, using the example of JFK again, right? There's hundreds of people that are investing in that. As long as us as a community define what good looks like, we need entrepreneurs to come and take care of that. And we need to listen, and that's hence why the whole process of our standard development is constant consultation. Because again, we don't know all of the answers. We need to put the problems on, listen to the consultations, and then bring that in. And finally, I just wanted to make a final point to your previous question, Owen. What does make companies move, right? To me, there are 3 incentives and disincentives. There are 3 things. It's differentiation, it's risk management, and it's money, right? Those are the 3 things. You either do because you want to differentiate yourself from your competitors, and that's probably the B2C types of companies. You either do it because you need to mitigate the risks, because you're seeing that the regulation is coming through, or the risks of losing market share is coming through, or you do it because of cash, either to make more cash or to avoid losing cash, which is also as important, right? Just saying, well, if your competitors will have to spend more money than you to do something, even if you have to spend money, it might be a good competitive advantage for you.
Right, and it falls nicely into that sort of 2 parts to SBTI, right? That individual responsibility, that's the nature of a climate emergency, it is going to be hard, but providing these sectoral pathways and these tools and these guidances and the inspiration, I think, is a really good way. And Kerry, similarly difficult question to finish up with, are we really going to recreate one target setting platform and then replicate it in nature? How do we start to think about more holistic ways, I suppose?
So I think it's some of this, and because right now we are seeing this plethora of frameworks and guidance, and in some ways that's just where we have to be as we evolve into a more organized, high integrity, regulated regime, so to speak, and so I think with respect to nature, there does need to be a moment for that. But I think we need that moment. I think we all need to align that the nature targets and frameworks that are being developed right now, they ultimately need to merge with the climate targets, and you cannot have climate solutions without preserving carbon sinks. It's just, we all know that as an industry, nature biodiversity targets and defining ambition and for different sectors and different types of companies. I mean, there hasn't been adequate attention, and I think we all know that. And so for that reason, I think we are in a moment where there probably does need to be dedicated attention, but I think the goal has to be merging. And I think I see VCM and VCMI are a good example of that. There needed to be dedicated attention on the demand side and the supply side. And now there's a really interesting merger. And so I'd like to see more of that, where we have time-bound processes, but with the ultimate goal of simple, few, and sophisticated standards that are much more holistic.
Right. Excellent. So we've got about a minute and a half left, so I can't see the audience terribly well, but we've got a little bit of time for a couple of questions there, if there's any from... There's a gentleman here. I think.
Hi. I'm Sid. I work for Alcom. We're a biochar project developer. I just had a quick question to Kerry, and I guess to Owen as well, since this stems from a gold standard report. But the question is more on, when you're talking about investing in moonshots, you're talking about creating a pathway without directly the use of carbon credits. And I think that brings out a broader issue with regards to creating an environment for indirect mitigation outcomes, and how exactly do you foster that without having a clear pathway towards carbon credits, to create systems, to create platforms, to create marketplaces that will eventually enable the carbon market to move ahead, but at this point there's no clear way, and you can't see that.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I mean, just from my perspective, in that beyond value chain, one of the really interesting things that SBTI put forward is, yes, direct mitigation outcomes are important, but there might be other things to finance that are on the pathway to that, whether it's R&D or investment in enterprise or technology, and those are the things that the carbon markets don't traditionally cover. But maybe, Carrie, if you want to reflect on that one as well. Yeah,
and I agree, Owen. I think the beyond value chain mitigation, I think that's a really interesting piece of work that is under development. I think that it's the consultation document is out for public consultation, I think, until July. So that's, I think there is a tackling of that. I also think an area that we don't talk much about, but is procurement, is joint procurement, and it's something that I mentioned earlier. We founded Frontier for carbon removal, early stage carbon removal investment at Google, and we joined up with five joint companies, and that was a moonshot. Essentially, it was almost $1 billion, and so the incentive was collaboration, bringing price down, innovation. There were many different incentives that I think all of the companies that founded it were responding to, and ultimately that will feed into the carbon markets. We'll see how it feeds in. I think we're all looking at where removals fit, but I think procurement is another driver that we should look more into.
Great. Well, that's at time. Do check out SBTI's net zero standard as a kind of key pillar of all of this, and the beyond value chain mitigation consultation that Kerry just mentioned. We also have a discussion paper on what a fair, directionally aligned, positive contributor looks like. You can scan that on our big screens via a QR code. And all that's left is to thank my panel very much for a lively session, and thanks to all of you for coming.